American-Born Chinese by Jean Lin Yang was the winner of the 2007 Michael L. Prince Award. It also was a finalist for the National Book Award. It won the Eisner Award for Best Graphic Album and the Publishers Weekly Award for Best Comic of the Year. The Michael L. Prince Award is an award that honors the best titles in young adult literature. And even though this is a children's literature class, I think it's often helpful to think of the crossover between children's literature and young adult literature. I've printed the criteria for the Prince Award for you here, and I'm just going to read that quickly. So they say, what is quality? We know what it's not. We hope the award will have a wide audience among readers from 12 to 18, but popularity is not the criterion for this award. Nor is message. In accordance with the Library Bill of Rights, controversy is not something we try to avoid. In fact, we want a book that readers will talk about. Librarianship focuses on individuals in all their diversity, and that focus is a fundamental value of the Young Adult Library Services Association and its members. Diversity is thus honored in the association and in the collections and services that libraries provide to young adults. And American-Born Chinese certainly represents that commitment to diversity, and I want us to take a look at some of the interesting representations of multiculturalism in this graphic novel. Yang braids together three distinct storylines in this novel. The Monkey King is the focus of the first, Jin Wang, who's a young Chinese-American boy, is the focus of the second, and then Danny and Chen Qi is the focus of the third. For each of these storylines, he draws on a particular history, Chinese history, as well as some specific generic characteristics that we're going to examine in a little more detail. The first narrative strain about the Monkey King draws on some Chinese folklore, specifically a book called Journey to the West, which Yang alludes to directly here towards the end of the novel. Journey to the West is about a pilgrimage of a legendary monk who traveled to India to obtain sacred texts and return after much suffering. It has its roots in the folk tradition and mythology, in Taoism and Buddhist philosophy. This story has remained pretty popular in Chinese culture over the years, and centuries of adaptation have kind of shifted focus away from the monk who made this pilgrimage and onto the Monkey King figure that Yang is employing here. The Monkey King, or Sun Wukong, as he's known in Journey to the West, shares many similarities with the Monkey King that we're looking at here, and you're going to notice a lot of these parallels. He's born from a stone, given a low position with the gods, and rebels against heaven, declaring himself to be the great sage equal to heaven. He's then punished for rebelling and kept under a mountain for 500 years when he's finally set free by the monk who accepts him as a disciple. His primary weapon is a staff that can grow and shrink. He's the master of 72 transformations, and he's considered a trickster figure. So you can see that Yang is really drawing quite directly on this folkloric tale from the Chinese culture. Then we have Jin Wang. This second narrative resembles the Bildungsroman plot that we've looked at quite a bit already this semester. It focuses on a Chinese-American boy who in many ways resembles just a typical American boy with a typical kind of Bildungsroman format. He likes toys, Transformers, he deals with bullies, he falls in love and freaks out about girls, all pretty familiar Bildungsroman plots that we've looked at already. However, Yang uses this Bildungsroman format to speak to the specific difficulties of growing up as a Chinese American. So the Transformer toy that Jin plays with, if we read the text there, we see that he wants to be like this robot in disguise. He likes it because it changes into something that looks completely different and becomes more than meets the eye. So if we take that as kind of a sign for one level in which we might read this whole narrative, we can think about the ways in which Jin tries to transform his own appearance in order to convey that there's something more to him than just his looks. So Yang comments on several of the sorts of stereotypes that he encounters, or that he thinks Chinese Americans encounter potentially as children, using Jin's experience in the classroom. So when Jin first comes to the school and she's introduced to the class, one of the students says, "My mama says Chinese people eat dogs," to which the teacher replies, "Now be nice, I'm sure Jin doesn't do that. In fact, Jin's family probably stopped that sort of thing as soon as they came to the United States." So there's clearly several problems here. Instead of thinking about some of the cultural differences or using this as a kind of teaching moment to discuss some of the cultural changes between our two countries and between these two families, or even thinking about Jin as an individual and asking, him to speak a little bit about his own personal experience, the teacher makes some assumptions here on several different levels, both on what Jin must do now and as well as what he must have done before. Another instance is when we see the reference to Suzy Nakamura, who the class assumes automatically that she and Jin must be related, and then when they find out that they're not, then it must be that they're getting married. So there's some assumptions here about the relationship between these two cultures. Suzy Nakamura, the name suggests to us that she's actually Japanese as opposed to Chinese like Jin, and so there's a collapsing of those differences and some assumptions made. The stereotype that Yang is probably trying to expose there is the idea that all Asians look alike. When Wei Shin-sun comes to the school, Jin initially reacts quite strongly against him because they come from similar cultures. Wei Shin-sun is Taiwanese. So Jin tells him, when he speaks to him in Chinese, no, you're in America, speak English. And we can see this as part of Jin's own transformation, where he's trying to deny this one part of his heritage or his culture in order to try and assimilate into the American culture. We see this again when he perms his hair. He's imitating some of the other kids in the class and trying to transform his outward appearance because he wants people to be able to look beyond the simple fact that he's Chinese. One of the more powerful moments in the novel, I think, occurs towards the end when we see Suzy talking to Jin, and she says, she's very upset, and she says, today when Chimmy called me a chink, and notice that she's kind of stuttering there. We've got the ellipses in this quotation. I realized deep down inside, I kind of feel like that all the time. So Yang is using this moment to show not just the way in which others are stereotyping the Chinese American children that we see here, but also how it's affecting them and affecting their own understanding of their own identity and having to sort of feel ashamed about who they are. Then we have our third narrative strain. So if the first one that we examined looked at folklore, and the second looked at the Bildungsroman and the coming of age for a Chinese American, this third strain draws on this kind of 90s sitcom genre. You'll notice with the sort of headings that are used here, it's in that style. The fact that we have the clap, clap, clap at the bottom of this, and we'll also have the ha, 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 ha. That sort of replicates the laugh track and the applause track that are often used in these kinds of sitcoms. Yang focuses this narrative on what seems to be a sort of prototypical American boy, Danny, blonde-haired athlete, and then juxtaposes that with his relative from China, Chen Qi, which quite obviously is almost it's a caricature of a stereotype of the kind of stereotypical Chinese, and we're going to look a little bit about where that stereotype comes from and what it's drawing on. Yang represents Chen Qi in this narrative in terms of pretty much the most racist stereotype possible. He tries to kind of throw everything in there. So just in this image, we can see from the name Chen Qi, right? So chink would be a derogatory term used to describe Chinese. He has the Q, which is sort of the stereotypical hairstyle. He's flipping the R's and the L's, which is, again, another stereotypical assumption made about language. His luggage in the background there is Chinese takeout boxes. So as many of the different sort of stereotypical representations as possible, Yang kind of shoves those in there. And he's drawing a lot on a very specific historical moment, which was called the Yellow Peril. So this happened when the United States was building the Pacific Railroad. They brought over a lot of labor from China. This is in the 19th century. And then after the railroad was finished, people started to realize, white Americans specifically, that the Chinese workers no longer had jobs, and they became really worried that they might start to compete with them for their own jobs. So in response to that, there was this huge wave of anti-Chinese and eventually anti-Japanese as well sentiment that just sort of spread throughout the United States. The Chinese laborers were called, this is a quote, the filthy yellow hordes, which eventually led to the National Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which prohibited immigration from China and then also forbade legal residents from becoming citizens. As you can see, the artwork that Yang's included here to represent Qin Ke, it has a lot of similarities with the kind of propaganda that is used in the 19th century to represent the Yellow Peril. A lot of the content is also going to be kind of similar. So you can see in the Yellow Peril image that he's holding a knife, shooting off a gun, while standing over a woman bleeding on the ground. And this kind of association of the Chinese immigrants with sexual aggression, rape, and sexual perversion is something that Yang incorporates into his text. Qin Ke makes several inappropriate advances towards Melanie. He sort of is obsessed with her looks and the idea that she might be able to bear him children. He says that he must bind her feet, which is again a cultural reference to a Chinese practice that Yang is representing here as just kind of the way in which we might think of it as a strange and foreign thing, as opposed to sort of trying to understand the cultural reasoning behind it. And then the sort of sexual aggression of wanting to sort of take her away and bear children, he seems as kind of a frightening figure. In addition to drawing on the Yellow Peril idea from the 19th century, this is also, I think, pretty explicitly drawing on some of the representations of Asians in the World War II era. The United States and Britain released a lot of anti-Japanese propaganda, images like these posters that you see here, that depicted the Japanese as sexual predators. You see the naked woman to the left, and also really created these stereotypically terrible animalistic representations of some of their features. And you can see that Yang is drawing pretty explicitly on that here. There's a lot of similarities in this image between the kind of drooling that's happening, the teeth, the eyes. So he's clearly drawing on a lot of different racial stereotypes of Asians and Asian Americans throughout history. Even though Qin Ke is maybe the most obvious and visible representation of discrimination and stereotyping in this book, Yang embeds these same kinds of ideas into each of the different storylines. So in the first narrative about the Monkey King, we learn very early on that he's not let into the dinner party despite the fact that he's a king, despite the fact that he's a deity, a god, he has powers. He's not let in simply because he's a monkey, unlike everybody else. In the next narrative with Wei Shen, when he's introduced to the class, the teacher says he's moved here all the way from China, and Wei Shen has to correct him and say Taiwan. Clearly the teacher doesn't know the difference or care about that cultural distinction. We also see a little bit later on in this narrative that Zhen ends up being warned away from Amelia, and even though we're not really sure, he doesn't give us a sort of specific reason why this kid is suggesting that he stay away from her. We can kind of infer that it has to do with the fact that as a Chinese American, he's just not quite right. He doesn't fit in with everybody else. And so this friend is saying that we're almost in high school, she's got to pay attention to who she hangs out with, suggesting that Jin is not that right person. And then even in the Qin Ke narrative, some of the representations of stereotyping are a little bit more subtle. For instance, we often see him throughout his classes raising his hand because he knows the answer first before everybody else. This is something that Danny seems to find particularly embarrassing. And this is a stereotype with Asian cultures often, that they're smarter than everybody else or good at math. And while these may seem like positive things, and sometimes are positive things, the fact that those assumptions are being made, Yang suggests, is another form of stereotyping. I can say from my own personal experience, my husband's Korean American, and despite the fact that he's lived in this country for almost his entire life, English is his first language, and he has a PhD in English literature, he's regularly complimented on how good his English is by strangers. So even though we might not always think of these things as discrimination, even sometimes positive associations, or what we might think of as positive, can have some negative consequences. One of the things that I think makes American-Born Chinese really great is the way that Yang threads these three very different narratives all together by the end of the book in some really unexpected and surprising ways. So we learn that Qin Ke is in fact the Monkey King, that Wei Shen is actually his son and disciple, and that Jin Wang and Danny are the same person, that Danny is basically that he has in fact transformed in the way that he wanted to be a transformer when he grew up towards the beginning. He sees himself as having made this transformation. So I want you to think about why Yang threads these together in the way that he does, and what kinds of comments he might be making about genre. So we discussed this as kind of a folk tale combined with a Bildungsroman, combined with a representation of a sitcom, 90s sitcom, and then the fact that this is actually represented as a graphic novel too, rather than just a novel, is interesting. So think about some of the larger implications of those decisions. Think about the ways that different themes are threaded together, things like identity and fitting in, things about race or culture. Also consider the way that he represents history. So we have 3 different historical moments that he integrates in with each of these narratives, and then also he grabs from a lot of other little moments too in the ways that he represents some of these things, as we saw with World War II. So think about some of the comments that he might be making about history or time, and then also consider what messages this text conveys, and how the way that he has represented both the text and the images helps to convey those messages. But Yang doesn't actually stop by just threading these 3 narratives together. He ends by, I think, encouraging us to think about some of the even more modern representations of Chinese Americans. So in this image that you see here, this is Wei Shen grown up, and he's representing him as the kind of Chinese gangster figure or gang figure. So Chinese gangs are really prominent, especially in areas like Los Angeles, and I think those representations inform the way that we think about the culture now. He also includes this final image all the way at the end of the text, and I don't know if you will recognize this or not. I have to say that I didn't first off, but I think it's really interesting what he's doing here. So this image actually is a sort of comic representation of a YouTube sensation called The Back Dorm Boys, which just kind of blew up the internet for a while. It's basically just these 2 Chinese boys doing covers of, not even covers, lip syncing to Backstreet Boys songs. And they're incredibly popular in part because people take them as these really comic things. And so I think it's also interesting to think about how Yang is encouraging us to consider the ways in which Chinese Americans and the representation of them is entering our current pop culture, and how we might want to either reconsider some of those representations or think more critically about them. So I invite you to think about both these and others that you can think of, where either Chinese Americans or Asian Americans, or race more generally, how it's being represented in some of our contemporary culture.